Hello, this is Josh from Luo, and this is going to be the first in a little series of videos about production. I'm going to cover a sort of range of topics in a range of different styles, from electronic music, metal, sort of weird areas of jazz and acoustic music and stuff like that. I'm going to recreate these sort of glitchy, distorted bass sounds from an ambient kind of breakdown section on our track Testament, which you can hear on our album Unspoken. The sort of vibe I was going for with these was something like you might hear in the video game Doom or the movie Tenet, but it's mainly inspired by technique shown off by Doom's composer Mick in a presentation that I'll leave a link to in the description. And he basically talks about his method of making really sort of texturally varied and punchy, distorted bass sounds that could be a stand-in for like a guitar in a heavy metal context. But what I think is really fun about it is the fact that he starts in an incredibly simple place, like sine wave playing a single note pattern, but with the right combination of effects like distortion and compression, we can basically instigate all of these other harmonics and bits of noise and stuff to kind of rise up from something quite minimalist. Now, the problem for anybody like me who wanted to have a go at making sounds a bit like this yourself is that Mick used a lot of modular synth stuff and physical guitar pedals, some of them being quite sort of unusual boutique ones that I think probably most people don't have in their collection. So this is essentially my sort of budget digital knockoff of his method using Ableton and a handful of plugins. So I thought I'd just explain all that to give a bit of context, as this is the first video, but with that slightly long intro out the way, let's jump right in from Scratchingtons. So this is the main keys riff from our track Testament. This was actually written by our drummer Barney, and I think this is maybe a cool way to show how we kind of work together. Is I'm using his riff here, but I'm going to use it as a backdrop for the sound design that we're going to create. Just turning up the sustain on the keys plugin, which is the Stage 73 by Arturia. And this is the bass patch that we're going to be working with. So for this technique to work, you want to start with a really clean bass sound like this. This will work a little bit better or worse depending on the key of your track, because you basically want the sub to be as low a note as possible where it's still perceptible and resonating nicely. If you go too low, it just becomes really rumbly, and then this won't work. On the other hand, if you go too high, you don't quite get the same texture. When you're in the middle, you know, it's all right. I'm just fiddling with this little coarse control here, and what that will do is add a second voice or a second note above the low sub note in addition. So the first step in this process is to add something called an audio effect rack, and that's essentially going to allow us to contain a whole bunch of effects in one convenient little box. And then after this, I'm going to load up another Ableton effect called Saturator, and the way that we're going to use this is basically as like a safety net. It's just going to make sure that nothing in the audio effect rack before it causes our sound to clip or go over 0 dB. You can see I'm pushing the drive knob quite loud on the saturator, but because the output knob is set to -12, we're never going to go over that roughly on the meter, as you can see. So because we're going to be adding a lot of distortion and compression that's going to make the signal louder, this is just a nice way of keeping everything sort of safe and controlled. So we're going to add our first sort of tonal color plugin, and this is something called Amp. It is an Ableton effect, but it only comes with certain versions of Ableton, unfortunately. And as you might have guessed from the name, it's basically going to sound like we're sending our bass sound through a bunch of different types of amps, and that's going to give us different textures and different types of distortion that we can switch between. I like this one because of the user interface and how all the different types of amps are just grouped together on the screen here, instead of like having to open up a plugin and scroll through a menu or something. It's all just right here on the screen, and that's going to be really useful towards the end of this. The next plugin we're going to add is this other Ableton effect called Erosion. And with this, you can hear how we can add this kind of nice, weird, bit crushy digital layer on top. Or this nice kind of hissy thing that we can control. So unfortunately, this thing isn't built into Ableton, but I'm going to load up this plugin called Texture by Devious Machines. And this thing is fucking awesome, man. So you can see the signal of our bass is hitting this plugin, and when it does that, it's going to trigger a sample in Texture, and it has a lot of really nice samples that we can choose between, and a lot of ways that we can control and affect the sound after that. So here you can see the big drop-down menu of all the samples that are available, and you can also load your own ones into it, which is fucking sick, but we're just going to use the built-in ones today. And the way that we're going to use this is we're going to use this mix knob on the right here to kind of morph between the original bass sound and the Foley sample that's in texture. So I'm going to add another third-party plugin here. It's got a bit of a sweaty name, but it's a really cool multi-effects thing called Effectrix, with an X. Then you can just basically go ahead and add some little blobby blobs of little effecty-wex. And the one that I'm particularly keen on in this plugin is the reverb. So when our sound reaches the end of that little pink reverb blob there, the reverb trail or decay is just going to stop completely abruptly. Normally in a reverb plugin you'll get a bit of a decay or a trail on the end of the sound, and that's typically what you'd want. But in this case, because what we're going for is this kind of really fast, instantaneous changing and like microsecond assaults of different textures and stuff, it's just a really useful, satisfying effect for that kind of vibe, I reckon. And then the next thing I'm loading up is this spicy little jabron called LiveCut, and I'm putting that before texture in the chain. So LiveCut's going to create random rhythmic variations and glitchy stutters in the bass pattern, and then that's feeding into texture afterwards. So you can see there that that's the bass sound coming in. You can see all the variations that are happening. And then you can use the mix knob to kind of catch some of those mid-stutter, and you can create these kind of batshit sounds morphing between this distorted bass and those crazy glitchy Foley moments. And then because we've got Effectrix set up after texture, some of those little stutters are occasionally going to get a little bit of reverb on them, or one of the other little effects that we painted in with the little blobby wobs. Unfortunately, some people might have a bit of trouble trying to get LiveCut to run on the latest operating systems, because I believe it's 32-bit and it hasn't been updated for quite a long time. So if you're in Ableton, an alternative that you could use is something like Beat Repeat. And you can use the grid knob in there to kind of get some of these similar glitchy rhythmic stutters happening. I'm just setting up some pitch modulation on the texture sample. You can see the pitch knob is now moving on its own there. And again, that's just going to help every single time this loop goes round. It's going to sound slightly different because the pitch is going to be in a different place. And moving on to the final step, we're going to load up a second audio effect rack at the end of everything, but still before our saturator. And then we're going to add a load of instances of this compressor called OTT. And yeah, this is going to do really, really silly things. And we're going to take that one insert of it and we're going to copy paste it just a whole bunch of times. And yeah, without going into too much detail about what this is doing, this is basically going to make the bass explode. Essentially, it's going to exaggerate everything going into it, and it's going to bring out all these extra noises and sort of clicks. And you can probably imagine that if we go back and start tweaking things like the amp settings and erosion, we're going to get some really drastic results. Oh, yeah, that little squelch there was because of our OTT setup. So now we've got our effects chain sorted, I'm going to create another audio track here, and basically this is going to be listening to our Josh sub bass track. And it's going to record everything coming out of it to audio. Basically, we're just going to go through and record ourselves fiddling with all the settings on these plugins and record a load of nonsense material that we can make a shorter loop out of. If you've got a MIDI controller or something with knobs on it, a bit like my Korg Nano Control here, you can assign all the controls in the plugins to the knobs and get a bit more hands-on, but I'm actually just using a mouse. Cool, so that's about 129 bars worth of me just like fiddling with all these settings and getting different sounds out of the setup. And I'm just going to go through and chop all of that into equal segments, put them on tracks below, and we're going to use this top track as our sort of master track, and we're going to mix and match little bits and pieces from all these other variations. And yeah, see if we can edit together something that's sort of maybe kind of usable. So let's just try swapping a little piece out with a bit from this take. That's a bit stinky, so let's try. That was marginally less stinky. So the idea is to just basically go through that top master track and listen to it, and if there's any bits that you're not quite keen on, we can just swap them out for another moment from one of these other takes. In hindsight, I probably should have color-coded some of these other tracks so you can see how we're patchworking this all together, but yeah, you can see that it makes the process of getting these kind of complicated sounds really just sort of easy and simple to work with. So once you've arrived at what you think your finished loop is going to be, you can highlight all of those edits, right-click consolidate, and that will create a single audio file. And there's our Aggie weird bass loop that we made from something really, really boring and simplistic. So now we've got that consolidated down to one file, it becomes a bit easier to work with and doing more edits. I'm just putting this on to control some of the high end so it doesn't get quite as harsh in your ears, basically. I'm just creating another pair of audio tracks that are panned left and right, and I'm going to take some little snippets of our bass loop and split them out onto these different tracks, and this is going to give us a cool kind of instantaneous cut in between the speakers. It's kind of up to you which ones to pick. I would personally spend a little bit longer on this and be a bit more careful about which cuts I'm choosing, but I'm just going to go with this to wrap up. So the last thing we're going to do is put a little bit of effect on these other tracks, and in this case I've just gone for some reverb so that we get a contrast between the upfront centered bass sound and some little moments of it are getting scattered away in these other spaces. Okay, so to wrap this up with, I'm just going to show you a couple of examples of how these sounds kind of work in context and some ideas that are a bit more developed, so we're not just hearing it against that Rhodes loop over and over again. So this is just a little idea me and a mate have started, trying to combine the sort of Doom and Tenet vibes together. So we've taken that chuggy guitar part and recreated it as MIDI using a version of the bass sound that we've made today, and then that's layered in with the heavy guitar, and it's also filling the spaces where it's not doing anything, so that's creating this really interesting call and response between the two things. And just for one more example of how you could use these sorts of sounds outside of the context of metal or heavy music, this is one of my solo tracks, which is more inspired by kind of UK dubstep and moody two-step garage. You can find that on Spotify and Bandcamp and all the usual places.